Okay, hello guys. Time to show you most difficult to face. It's second most popular choice against main lines of the Sicilians when you play e4, c5, knight f3, and when you play d6, and it's called Moscow variation. It's third move, bishop b5. Against other variations, such as knight c6, bishop b5 is called Rossolimo. Some guys even call here bishop b5 Rossolimo. No, it's not. It's called Moscow variation, but since one guy whose name was Esteban Canal played it first, some people and some players even call it Canal attack. Anyways, after knight f3, d6, bishop b5, for a long time, black has been having problems how to react, because if you play knight c6, then you transpose into the Rossolimo, and this variation is considered to be pretty much okay for white. Then another question is, if you play bishop d7, when they take on d7, whether you take by queen or by knight, these positions are not so easy for playing for black, especially if you would like to push for a win, and especially because by swapping off like pair of minor pieces, I'm talking about the light square bishops, we can hardly push and complicate the game. And that's why I decided to show you knight d7 variation. And I remember back to 1990 when Ljubomir Ljubovic, one of the best Serbian players ever, when he played against Garry Kasparov, he played bishop b5, and Kasparov in that game went for knight d7. I remember when Kasparov went for that knight d7, at that time it was considered to be pretty dubious and pretty passive. But the point of knight d7 is very nice with all these engines and after all these years. So let me just explain you what's the point after knight d7. So when you go with the knight d7 thing, you first have to understand that no bishop d7 is now possible, because when you take by bishop, you've just won the bishop pair. And that's a good thing about this one. So we gotta consider any bishop d7 now or later to be in favor of black. Another thing after knight d7 is that right now we're just defending from that check on b5, and we're willing to play at first and in the first part of the game a little bit more passive, but in general we're relying on the bishop pair in many of these lines, or just a flexible pawn structure. So let's go. The main representatives of this knight d7 in the world, I mean all the guys played it because bishop b5 became so popular, and when they don't feel like playing all those theoretical variations such as Najdorf, Dragon, and other stuff, they just go with third move bishop b5. And everybody went for bishop b5 with the white pieces in the past couple of years. Magnus Carlsen, Caruana, Nepo, and all these guys. But from another point of view, when you want to push for a win with the black pieces, you should be playing knight d7. And just like I previously said, I was mainly, how should I say, affected and infected by the games of Maxim Vachier-Lagrave, who's got a great experience and great results with it. Altogether with him, I can mention Wesley So, but of course, Magnus Carlsen, Caruana, Nepo, and Firouzja play knight d7 sometimes, occasionally, sometimes as their main weapon against Moscow variation. So let's begin. There are 5 moves after bishop b5. I would like to begin with probably the least common bishop a4. Bishop a4 got its popularity in the last couple of years, mainly thanks to Nakamura, Ukrainian, top GM Elyanov, and one of the best French players, Etienne Bacra. The point behind bishop a4 at first is extremely weird. You just say, I don't get it. I just gave check, and now I'm just stepping up and stepping back, actually, with my bishop to a4. But the point behind bishop a4 is that they want to go and go away from a6 followed by b5 with tempo. That's one thing. And second thing, just like you see my arrows, I want to play c4. I mean, white wants to play c4 and wants to play some sort of Marazzi-bind structures. That's one way of trading these systems. Another way of trading these systems is being able to go back to the shelter c2, from where white is going to play for a flexible center with c3 and d4 afterwards. Those are two plans. After bishop a4, we should develop our knight g on f6. And this is a moment to explain you something very interesting. When you play knight g on f6, yes, you do attack the pawn on e4, and yes, we would like to take it now. But usually, even though you attack the pawn on e4, when they play short castle, and that's the main move in this position, we don't want to take it. Simply, we don't want to take it because the knight on d7 is really passive by the bishop on a4. The king could have some sort of difficulties. They would like to go, in case we go with the knight e4, with the rook e1 and d4 for the full center and the full activity of the pieces there. And that's why, after a short castle, we should be going with e6. So this is like one of those moments when in one of the French, for example, Portish variation, you play queen a4, attacking pawn on a3, pawn on c2 and d4, but you don't want to take these pawns. Just like this, you're doing more like for developing reasons knight g on f6, but you don't want to take on e4, and you actually carry on developing yourself with e6. So after a6, they have a couple of ways to trade it. If they go with c4, I still wouldn't dare to take on e4. I would just complete my development in the most flexible fashion. And this is what I like about this setup. I just play, you look at this, knight bd7, knight f6, bishop e7. When you play like d4, we always take. I play short castle, and when they go for knight c3, play a6. If there's a good thing about this one, it's a thing to simply remember. You play some sort of Hitchcock position where they have lots of problems how to fight against the pawn on d6. They don't have bishop f4 because of e5. They don't have e5 because you're just controlling it twice. And in general, they have nothing. Apart from this, there's another thing in this situation. For example, if they don't play d4, but they play d3, what should be your plan afterwards? I very much like the plan that I found in some of these lines, a6, queen e2. And now you can play b6 followed by bishop b7, being pretty much flexible and waiting for white's reaction. But I also like gambiting, like in Benko style, b5, and it just goes after bishop a4, fourth move by white, and this line, because the bishop is on a4. So when you play b5, and when they take, you go with the knight b6, harassing this bishop, and afterwards going with a takes b5 and bishop a6, which is absolutely fine for black. Okay, just like I told you, you just have to play flexible and to kind of look for Hitchcock type of the games. Those who play d3, that d3 is pretty old plan, with the idea of doing all kinds of c4, knight c3, bishop somewhere, but then they want to go back with the knight somewhere. Knight on f3 goes on h2, h3, knight h2, or goes to g5 to be able to launch some sort of the kingside attack with f4. So when they play d3, you play bishop e7, c4 castles, knight c3, a6 with the idea of b5. If queen e2, for example, queen e2, you always have this b5 followed by c takes and knight b6. And this is what Giri used against Šarić in a rapid game this year during the summer. So black absolutely has a satisfying game. But if you don't feel like sacking some material and playing some gambit lines, you can just go with a flexible queen c7, flexible b6, flexible bishop b7, and in the meantime they go knight h2 to be able to do f4. Those who play like this, they would like to do some sort of the pawn storm on the king side with f4, g4, and to do, in general, some sort of like pawn storm and attack on the king side. That's why we just have to retreat with the knight on b8, go with the knight on c6, and afterwards we're either going for knight d4, but more likely knight goes to d4 in order to support d5 breaks in the center. Very, very interesting ones. And after castle e6, I believe that most of your opponents almost on autopilot will answer with a rook e1, defending this pawn on e4, to be able to go with both. Either c3 followed by d4 or c4 going for some sort of Marazzi bind structures. Both are possible. Anyways, you play a6 and you send them a clear message. Decide whether you want to go back with that bishop to c2 and play it like this, or you want to go with c4, in which case bishop e7, knight c3 castles, d4, we just go with c takes, knight takes, and it's very important not to make b6 first because of knight c6, and in which case you would blunder something like this, but you just first go with the queen c7 to be able to afterwards play b6, but not immediately because they will still threaten knight c6. So we just want to go with the rook e8, go back with the bishop on f8, and then go with b6, bishop b7. Those are the things that we want to go for in these positions. And that's how I'd treat the variation with bishop a4. Just like I said, it became very popular lately since Nakamura uses this system in his rapid and blitz games. And that's why after bishop a4, playing knight g on f6, attacking that pawn, playing e6, and afterwards a6, b5, or doing stuff like that is one of the most important things. So, all things considered, this flexible approach should work perfectly fine against bishop a4. Another thing in this situation is a4. a4 is Carlsen's favorite move. He likes to do it very often. Anish Giri likes to play a4 as well, and Wesley So. There is a clear point behind a4. And apart from the fact that it's a simple space grabbing move, because now when we play a6, whenever we play a6, we can play 6, but afterwards it cannot be followed by b5. And that's why you have to understand that those who play a4, they just want some sort of like space on the queen side, and they just want to fight against these typical plans and ideas by black. So of course we play knight g on f6, and of course that we don't take on e4 if they play castle. In other cases, of course, we do threaten the pawn on e4, just like in previous line. So if they play knight c3, all you have to remember about this line is to play a6, bishop c4, and to go with the idea of b6. That's a crucial thing, and that's one of the most important points of this line. It's fighting against a5 by white. When you play b6, you're fighting against a5. You're fighting against these inflexibility. You want to have, like afterwards, bishop b7. And mainly, you just want to have like a pretty nice and pretty easy game in the center. So that's one thing. I just have to tell you one thing. For example, many of the guys, my students who used to play the dragon, they didn't feel, or they were unfamiliar with the main idea. And in these positions, they just played some sort of like a6, bishop c4, g6, and when white plays a5, they go with the bishop g7. Well, I just have to tell you one thing. That's exactly the point of this variation, and that's exactly how you're not supposed to play this line. First, looks like you play a typical dragon-like setup. Second thing, they push this pawn all the way to a5 and got the queen side, pretty much stable position and space. And imagine this happens, and all of a sudden, boom, bishop f7. So after king f7, knight g5, if king f8, knight e6 wins the queen. if king g8, then they have 96. Queen cannot no longer go to a5 or c7. It has to go here. Knight c7 just wins the rook or the queen, and white is winning. And finally, if you play king e8, they just trap the queen on d8 like this. Watch out, because I'll be honest with you, even I blundered, I believe, not even once, I believe I blundered it twice in my blitz games, and I didn't pay too much attention. So I just said, okay, this is a normal stuff. I played a6, kicked that bishop away, unpinned my knight. Let me just complete my development. I didn't feel this a4 like nothing that special. And when I play bishop g7, when I confront this bishop f7, I just said, that's the point, and that's how they crush black in this position. So this is the thing, and this is the thing. Finally, about a4, knight g on f6, short castle, you just go with a6. This is the point, and this is the point where, but let me before that explain this knight c3 first. Knight c3, they defend the pawn. You kick the bishop away, and now when they threaten a5, and at some point bishop f7, you just play b6. I'd like to emphasize the importance of the following thing. They can't sack now, because this would be like in modern Philidor. King f7, knight g5, king g8, knight e6, queen e8. And just when they think that they're about to win the rook, I would rather call this rook on a8 poison rook, because after queen g6, now we're going after the g2 pawn. They take, we take on g2, we threatening the rook, and afterwards, after rook f1, we want to play knight e5, go for the bishop g4, and they have just lots of problems. Black is winning. So because of this, against an immediate b6, it doesn't work. Also, I'd like to once again explain the point of b6. It's a very flexible, it's a strong move, it's fighting against a5. Any a5 you'll be able to meet with b5, and that's how we play in the most flexible fashion these positions. After I like castles, bishop b7, rook e1. Now I like Svidler's double fianchetto. I checked on the engines. Engines usually say play knight e5. This knight e5 is a very original concept where you put the knight into the center. You're fighting against d4 by white. And after knight e5, d takes e5. Now they can't play anything but d3. Then you play e6. If they ever break with f4, which we should expect, you just go with this, and black just has a very, very solid game. I wouldn't say that anyone is any better in this position. Fairly unclear. But you know what? I like maybe Svidler's approach in this position a little bit more. Now, when we made pretty much sure about the flexible reactions to face any a5 with b5, now we can go with the double fianchetto with g6. I like the double fianchetto position. So after d4, c takes, queen takes, bishop g7. This reminds me on nothing else but typical hedgehog, where you have the double fianchetto, where we have these flexible knights, and where we just want to go with these flexible type of things, such as e6 and this type of stuff. This is a nice thing, and that's what we have to know about these type of games. Another thing, let me just show you Svidler's game. This guy played bishop d5. Svidler played queen c7. He just reacts in the most flexible fashion. This guy played bishop b7, queen b7, plays knight d5. And what I especially like about this game, and also it has to be approaching your games as well, you gotta be original, and you just shouldn't be in such an aggressive mode, at least not at first, which means you just need to have like some skills of being talented, how to develop your pieces on the 8th, 7th, and 6th rank, so to be a little bit passive, but then all of a sudden to get like a proper counter chances. After like knight e5, rook c8, Svidler attacked the pawn. This guy played rook e2. Svidler played h6. An amazing move. An amazing move that basically prevents bishop g5. And bishop g5 would be important because altogether with the queen on d4 and knight on d5, it would pretty much create lots of pressure against the knight on f6. Also, by playing h6, he's also giving himself something even more interesting, because look at this. You would say, but why is that a threat? You can play castle because e7 pawn is hanging. So that's why he plays h6, avoiding bishop g5, but also getting something else, avoiding at some point bishop h6. And now you say, how the hell he would like to go with the bishop h6? I'll show you. When after h3, Svidler played king f8, which was a beautiful move, and now he overprotects the pawn on e7. I mean, still protects the pawn and overprotects the bishop like this, and basically wants to jump off with the knight, for example, threatening to take on d5. Now he's pretty much forcing white to come up with his decision and to do something, probably to take. When he takes, now you'll see the point of h6. Now the bishop takes on f6. He wouldn't be able to stick his bishop on h6 with tempo and with jack. And that's how, after bishop f6, attacking the queen with tempo, your king comes on g7 being absolutely flexible. This is absolutely remarkable maneuvering by Svidler in seemingly difficult position. You know what? Take a look at this game once again at home and ask yourself and be objective to yourself. Would you ever play h6, king f8, and stuff like that? I'm going to help you. I'll be honest to myself and to you. I would never play that. So after c3, knight c5, he's attacking the pawn, queen, and this pawn, breaking with minority attack with b5, going with minority attack, and all of a sudden even creating a weak backward pawn on, or before that actually, and after that isolated pawn on c3. Beautiful game between Blomqvist and Svidler, who was having black pieces and won in the European Club Cup in 2018. So just like you see, we've seen these ideas after bishop a4 and a4. Basically, just like a small recap before we go to other variations, whether they play bishop a4, which plan could be c4 to avoid a6 and b5, or c3, rerunning that bishop to c2 via a4. You just go with knight g on f6, attacking this pawn, but when they play castle, you play a6. On a4, you play knight g on f6, and when they play castle, you play first a6, followed by nothing else but e6 again. And that's how you trade these positions. I believe that in both of these cases, whether they play a4 or bishop a4, you just go in the same fashion. I like this one. Previously, we saw how Svidler played against knight c3, but after castles, a6, bishop c4, I believe that e6 is absolutely cool. Now you threaten to take because you want to play after knight e4, rook e1, d5. They have to defend this pawn, and now you go with a flexible b6. No more a5 because of b5. So when they play d4, you always take, you always get this flexibility. A bit of a problem in these positions could be pawn on e6, just like in Sozin variation of the knight or line, and that's what we have to take into consideration seriously there. And that's why you gotta be familiar with these lines and to know to play them really well. Of course, you can play bishop e7 here because of bishop e6. You just have to play some sort of knight c5 before you take these developing actions. We've seen those two moves, bishop a4 and a4, and it's time to check the c3. c3, I call it a Rai Lopez attempt in Moscow variation. Those who play c3, they would like to get a strong center afterwards, and that's going to be a pretty dangerous and difficult for facing and playing. And at the same time, when they have to reroute this bishop back into the center and the game, they're going to do it by a4, playing bishop a4 followed by bishop c2. So after c3, knight g on f6, it just attacks the pawn. They have to defend it at queen e2, keep chasing the bishop away. And of all the moves here, and in general you can play e6, followed by bishop b7 and bishop b7 and short castle, which is a flexible approach, and I played it once and had a fairly easy game with black. You can play e5, which reminds me of Ray Lopez. So you play this, queen c7, and if they play d5, you should be going for Carlsen's plan, rook b8 followed by c4, setting that knight to c5 and getting a pretty nice and well-controlled game. There is also a line with a4 where you play rook b8, and when they take. When they play knight a3, you push c4. But if they first play a takes, knight a3, I like b4, taking, and just getting a very normal game with the black pieces, with the chances on both sides of the board. In general, I'd say that engine says it's equal. Engine say it's equal. I'd maybe give tiny bit better game to white, maybe because they have some bishop a3, d takes e5, rook c1 ideas, but we also have like fairly fast rook fc8 afterwards and getting like almost immediately a great position. And finally, if after c3, knight gnf6, queen e2, a6, bishop c2, I have a specialty for you. a6 is flexible, e5 is okay, kind of Ray Lopez type of the structure, but I like c4. c4 is a move that scores absolutely the best for black in the practice. The point of this is to basically fight against d4. So any d4, we should just take en passant on d3 and play a normal game. So after like c4, they have all kinds of reactions. I would begin with d4, because that's why we play this move. We take, and now we just go c4, g6. We're going to play bishop g7, bishop e7, complete our development with short castle. I absolutely don't see any problems for black here. Then I know many guys in this position would go castle. Then you play e5. What's the point? They can play d4 because we would just take on d3 followed by knight c5. And if they play b3 to undermine the structure, which looks logical, you play queen c7. And you keep this pawn on c4 as it is. And basically it's fighting against d4. And at the same time, whenever they just take and go after the pawn on c4, we go with the knight b6, defending it and having a fairly nice and easy game afterwards. So that's the thing, and that's how we should be playing these positions. Finally, in case of castles, I just told you that we go with b3, queen c7. In case they go with an immediate a4 undermining these pawns, you always go with the bishop e7, a takes, rook a8, queen a8. And now they have problems with the pawn on e4. So even after knight a3, you take on e4, knight b5, threatening knight c7. You just go with the queen b7 with full flexibility and position without any problems. All things considered, these positions are just nice for playing. And finally, if they play b3, where they go after the pawn on c4 and they just try to move it away, we just go with either queen c7, defending it. So after b takes, knight a3, knight b6, which is a classic way of keeping an eye on the pawn on c4, or and if e5, you just take knight, bishop e6, over protecting, and then knight f to d7, releasing kind of a pressure against the c4 pawn. And this variation scores well in the practice for black. Or you can just take on b3, which doesn't look that like obvious and not that logical. So when they go d4, g6, d4, bishop g7, you shouldn't be aware of e5 because you have that knight d5, and now that e6 doesn't give them anything because we just get a pawn for free. The fact is that a queen e6 loses the queen on e6 like this by the bishop on c8. And just like you see, so many different variations, so many different plans, even by black. So what I'm actually trying to do in this lecture is not just to tell you, hey, play this plan, because I'm showing you a plan that maybe fits my style. I'm giving you options. I'm giving you flexibility, alternatives. Here I gave you c4, and I told you, always defend this pawn. Play queen c7, knight b6, and fight against d4. And then I gave you e5, and if you ever were an e5 player, you should be familiar with this type of positions. And I just told you, play rook b8 and play like flexible type of Royal Lopez structure. And finally, if they go with bishop c2 and you go with e6, I told you you're just playing like kind of a flexible position where you're not fighting against their center. They have this pretty strong center, but then you just play flexible bishop b7, short castle, queen c7, rook fc8, and once again, black just has a very normal and nice flexible game. We've seen 3 continuations: bishop a4, a4 and c3. Time to check the 2 main lines. Absolutely the most popular for all these years was d4, because d4 was White believed that after d4 he just takes an immediate control of the center and takes advantage of the seemingly weak knight on d7. Well, that used to be the treatment here, but not anymore. After d4 you take, and they're gonna take by queen. Lately, I've seen so many good players went for the knight d4 here. Then you play knight g on f6, attacking the pawn. And when they play short castle, you never take it, as you know, you kick it away. And if they go with bishop a4, play e6, play bishop e7, they bring the bishop back, play castle. And now before you play b6, play queen c7, b6, bishop b7, rook e8, bishop f8, rook a c8, and you just play a game like this. The point is that this guy went for these bishops with Marazzi bind structure and wants to go for checkmate. And this structure is really, or at least was considered to be bad for black. Or at least, let's put it this way, it's dangerous for us. But what are we supposed to do? We play rook e8, we reposition our bishop to f8, we play g6, put the bishop on g7, and do you still have an attack with the rook g3 and bishop, these 2 bishops? No, you do not. So nowadays, just like you see, black even developed this type of defensive ideas how to play against this type of games. Also, all the time I keep mentioning Hitchcock type of the games. Guys, if you're not familiar, you just have to check like few games of Gary Kasparov when he was younger, of some other top guys who used to play Hitchcock positions. Those are games where you have a structure like this, exactly like this: knight f6, knight e7, bishop e7, these 4 pawns, and it's called Hitchcock, just like the thorns of that animal. None of the knights can jump into the center, and you're just, locking all these kinds of active possibilities by white, but at the same time, you're defensive enough. So I just showed you that a knight d4 doesn't seem to be working because of the stuff I just showed you. Everyone is going to take on d4, and I remember when I played like 20 years ago, being very young, and I didn't want to go into some sort of Scheveningen variations, I just decided to play against Grandmaster Tosic queen d4. I played that, I enjoyed my game. Eventually we drew the game. I had better chances, but I didn't know how to finish him off at some point. Yes, I also played bishop b5 occasionally, and I also wanted to avoid all these main lines of the dragon, Najdorf, Rouser, Scheveningen, and these type of stuff. Anyways, after queen d4, it's time to show you some very nice flexible structures. We gotta ask them what are they going to do, and that's why you play e6. And now they need to decide whether they should give up this bishop for the knight or to move it somewhere. If they move it, for example, to e2, that's a small probability that you're gonna face in the game. It's just important to remember, you play knight g on f6, you play e5, which absolutely makes no sense because you're weakening these 2 squares. But when you do that, if they keep an option of bishop g5, you always before that have to play h6 without giving them bishop takes f6, because white should be happy to give up bishop for the knight, because then he's gonna have an easier control over the d5 square. But since in this game the guy played queen e3 and bishop g5 is no longer a threat, the guy played knight c5, bishop e7, bishop d7, castles, reposition this bishop, the way where it should belong. And in a game Bogdan Dak against Vidit played last year, Black, actually Vidit, had easily better game, equalized, and eventually even won. So after like d4, c takes queen d4, you always should force them with a6, simply by forcing your opponent to play, actually by playing a6, you're forcing him to decide whether to go back with the bishop to e2, because bishop a4 doesn't work to b5 and knight c5, while the bishop d3 is not also good because of knight c5. And that's why I believe that who plays originally Moscow variation, he should give up this bishop for the knight and rely on this position. And this is what I spoke in the beginning lesson. And in the beginning of the lesson, I just said those who play with the bishop pair, they just rely on some sort of I don't know, aggressiveness in this position, while at the same time we just go with rook c8, e5, kicking that queen away and playing like this. So it's time to check this one. Now they have c4 approach basically, and without c4 approach. But take a look at that queen. It is going to turn out to be a weak piece at some point. So let's go. So many moves and possibilities for white here. There are guys who will play this interesting move, bishop g5. The point behind bishop g5 is to avoid knight f6, because in any or on any knight f6, they would just take on f6 and break the pawn structure. Because of that, we just have to start harassing this bishop on g5 with h6. And right now, you can't play g5 because the rook is hanging. They keep having this annoying bishop, and we can't develop g5. We cannot, because of bishop f6. We can't chase that dark square bishop away with g5, so it's difficult. Here, we go with a rook c8. Rook c8 going after the pawn on c2. And here they have two kinds of ways. Actually, three kinds of reactions. They can play short castle, they can play knight c3, and they can play c4. Let me just show you what's happening. Those who play c4, well, it's not a big deal, and you shouldn't be too afraid of reactions like this, because you just have like an easy break with b5. Breaking like this and attacking the white center is of crucial importance in these positions, considering the fact that we can't play knight f6, that they keep having this bishop on g5 and h4, so we cannot play knight f6 or g5, and now we just have to apply somehow some sort of activity in the game where we would give our bishop some space and open diagonals. So that's why we play b5. They mainly go with the knight c3, almost on autopilot when I play these games. Then you go with e5. This is the point. That's why I told you is of crucial importance to go with this type of idea, e5. e5 is attacking the queen when the knight is on c3. Imagine the knight wasn't on c3. Then when they take on d8, you would take on d8, but you wouldn't attack the knight. Here, it works because bishop is hanging and knight is hanging, and they can't play this position. So this is the point. And that's why after knight c3, we can give ourselves possibility to play e5. So don't forget about this very nice rook c8, forcing the knight to come to c3, and now you play e5. And e5, the point about e5 is that we're happy when we play e5 and h6, because when they move the queen, and they have to do it, we now chase it away with g5. That's one more reason why after early bishop g5 we go with the idea of h6 and g5. We're just fighting against the bishop on h4. So when they play bishop g3, we play knight f6. We're completing development, and almost everyone, absolutely everyone in this position, go with h4. They're immediately attacking. If they play long castle, you just play queen c7. Now you want to go with b5 and b4, going after the c2 weakness. They go king b1, b5, and queen c5. I want to play e5 and b4. This reminds me of some, I can't call them dragon positions, but I like typical Sicilian games where I'm just launching a queenside attack. Then apart from this, instead of long castles, they go h4. And on h4, for many years, I've been using here rook g8 with flexibility, and black is fine in that position. I play rook g8, h takes g5, h takes g5, long castles. I play bishop e6, bishop e7, and doing stuff like this. Doesn't matter. And I was doing fine. I was basically doing fine. They can never jump because we should take and play f5 afterwards and playing a game like this. But you know what? Then I realized, don't play like this, but play g4. Kick the knight away with tempo. That's what I'm doing. So after like d4, okay, so this is the thing. You just kick the knight away with this move. And when you play g4, they gotta move the knight back. You play h5. This h5 now gives you at some point, for example, bishop h6, controlling everything and doing stuff like this. White goes knight c4 after the pawn on d6, bishop e6, attacking the knight. Knight to e3, controlling the d5. And you go with the queen on b6. You just go after the pawn on b2. After, look at this. If they play long cat, first of all, they have problems now. Their bishop is locked. They can't take advantage of the d5 square anymore because we're defending it twice. And if they take and if they jump twice, we're just gonna go after the c2 pawn. b2 is hanging as well. So after castles, queen b2, now we're attacking the knight. Knight c d5, knight d5, e takes d5, bishop d7, rook a b1, queen c3. We're up a bishop pair. I say up a bishop pair because they get a piece back. We take on d3 and play f5. Don't get me wrong, but I'd be very happy to be black in this position. I'm enjoying a strong center. I'm enjoying the strong center. Sorry, rook d7 is not an option. I just wanted to point out an importance of the bishop pair, of these strong pawns in the center, possibility to push f4 to go after the bishop and the knight, and to play something like this. So this is the thing. All things considered, after like g4, knight d2, h5, knight c4, bishop e6, and queen b6, black is doing great in these positions. And on top of all that, that queen on b6 attacks the pawn on b2, controls so many other things, and just gives black a very, very nice game. So that's why after bishop g5, it's of crucial importance to do h6 first. If they play castle, same approach. You play e5, attacking the queen with tempo. They move the queen, and now if you want to play knight f6, always play h6. Never play knight f6, because if you play knight f6, and that's so bad, don't forget, they play bishop g5, they take it, and then they will have like nicer and easier control in general of positional d5 outpost. So you just have to go with a rook c8. Rook c8 threatens bishop b5 to win an exchange. They gotta go c4. You undermine this with b5. They gotta play b3. Then you create an isolated pawn, go after it, play knight f6, bishop e7, short castle, bishop e6, and this let's call it repositioning of the pieces is so typical for these structures. In case they go knight a3 to defend on c4, you play queen b6. They go with tempo. You retreat your queen on b7, holding the b5 square, controlling e4 square, and basically doing all kinds of flexibilities. In this game was c takes b5, a takes b5, rook f to e1, attack the pawn on e4, bishop g5, knight h5. When you don't have h6, and maybe h6 is a little bit late to do it here, you play knight f6, go with the knight on h5. You never let them take on f6. Go with rook c1, h6 now, and just like you see, you have enough flexibility to play a game like this. And believe it or not, you're down a pawn, but black was better and eventually even won this game. You're down a pawn, you threaten when to take on h4, when to break with d5, you have the bishop here, so black is just doing fine. And apart from bishop g5 and short castle, there is a knight c3 move as well. Then you kick the queen away with e5, and after queen d3 you play rook c8, short castle and queen c7. It's just fighting against knight e5 because the c2 is weak. Rook d1, you know the golden rule. You always have to play h6 without giving them bishop g5 before you develop your knight on f6. Knight e2. If this knight cannot go, and in this case it cannot go to c4, it actually goes back to f1, goes on e3, and takes full control of the d5 outpost. You can play bishop e6 in this position to do something more active with this bishop, but I like always bishop g4, provoking them to play f3. It's typical provocation. So after f3, you go back. Now they have weak dark squares, knight f6. Now they don't have bishop g5 because the pawn is on h6. You play bishop b7, and whatever they do, you just go short castle, b5, and black just has a very, very nice position and a nice game. And that's why I believe that a real players of Moscow variation should avoid this by playing c4. And that's why after d4, c takes, queen takes, a6, bishop d7, I believe that we're going to face c4 the most. That doesn't change anything in our plan. We always play with seemingly illogical e5. I say seemingly illogical because we're now just giving up on the half the d5 square, but you have enough resources to defend it. You play e5, undermining these pawns in the center, and then you play, since they now threaten to take, you can play queen b6, but I wouldn't like to provoke them to play bishop e3, so my move would be queen b8. I have a full flexibility. Once again, I insist, I have the bishop here, and all I have to make sure about is, if you play castles, to play h6 before I go with knight f6. So you can't play bishop g5, bishop takes f6. So you go with h6, b3, knight f6, bishop b2. And right now this bishop can no longer go there, which is of great importance for us. So we just go with the queen b7, going after the pawn on e4. And this is the thing. Now they play rook e1, now we're protecting the pawn. Bishop e7, short castle, and black is just doing really, really fine. So just like you see, all these plans, let's make, and to cut the long story short, any early fork move d4, you take, you force the bishop to decide, and when they take, whether they play c4, knight c3, short castle, you play e5, so c4 you play e5, followed by b5, whether they play like knight c3, you play e5, followed by rook c8, queen c7. But whenever you want to develop your knight on f6, just make sure to, before that, play h6. They go castle, you go e5. You wanna play knight f6, first play h6. You want to play rook c8 to threaten bishop b5. As soon as they play c4, undermine with b5. Then you support it with queen b6. This queen hides itself on the flexible b7 square. And finally, main line, after 97, short castle. Here, I was thinking, should I show you knight g on f6 or a6 immediately? And I believe that a6 cuts the things a lot, because you force them to take or to move the bishop. Those who take, you just take by bishop. If they play d4, if they play c3, you play knight f6, attacking the pawn. If they ever push e5, you take, and develop the bishop. It's important to develop it here to control the light squares. If they play rook e1 to defend the pawn, so they can afterwards go with d4, you just go e6, d4, play bishop e7, e5, d takes, knight jumps on d5, and everything looks cool. Then you just go back with the knight on b6, attacking the pawn on c4. Then queen goes on c7, bishop goes on c6, rook goes on d8. Just a normal game with mutual chances. But I don't think anyone would play like this. This bishop d7 is not even common. When they play d4, you just take. When queen takes, you play e5, and once again you go rook c8, b5, h6, knight f6. And that's what you have to remember about these positions when they take on d7. That's a good thing, because this line bishop d7 is not a reminiscence, but in many positions, it's absolutely the same line when they take by queen. It's the thing that we've just analyzed with short castle. So you play e5, you just go with the rook c8 to threaten b5, and when they play c4, you just undermine the center and the Marazzi bind pawn structure with b5. It's good position for us. In case of a6, they just go back with the bishop on e2. Nothing. You just develop knight, attack the pawn, and when they play d3, we just go g6. Now we go for that bishop g7, short castle in a game like this. I want to play b6 and bishop b7 with a double fianchetto. That's the one thing. And another thing is if they go with, for example, d4, now I can play b6 because of knight c5 attacking with tempo. And now since I cannot play b6 and bishop b7, we can go with bishop d7 like Gary played against Pratke in the game played in Rapid 2023. But you know what? If you're unhappy with these kinds of positions and structures, I believe that playing a6, because now he can no longer jump anywhere, also typical Hedgehog, then you can go with queen c7, b6, bishop b7, where you should play your rooks, rook e8 and rook c8. So just like you see, if we can discuss about any of these things throughout this lesson, I would just like to mention either go with the Hedgehog positions or go with this e5 when they give up the light square bishop for the knight, followed by rook c8, b5, and h6, knight f6, where they don't have any more bishop g5. Bishop to d3. This bishop on d3 is like a Kopetz variation because they want to go back with the pawn on with the bishop on c2 after they play c3 and break with the d4. Seemingly very illogical bishop d3 got its popularity, so we played knight g and f6. And whether they play c3, where we play e6, bishop c2, b5, d4, bishop b7, rook e1, bishop e7, knight bd2, queen c7, knight f3 castles, knight g3, rook fc8. I am of opinion that this very, very flexible game looks really strong for black. We have a nice control of the center, and sooner or later they just have to break with e5 and to do some sort of attack on the king side. I believe we have enough defensive resources to defend our game. So after bishop d3, knight g and f6, they mostly go with the rook e1. You play e6, and this is the thing to analyze there. When they play c3, to be able to go back bishop on c2 and push d4, or even on f1 and to push d4, you just go b5. So when they play bishop c2, which makes sense since they brought a bishop back to d3, we play c4. And you know that c4 is aimed against d4. And I just have to tell you one practical thing about this c4. We've seen it at some point. I believe it was against c3 variations throughout this lesson. And it was extremely annoying for white players. And in practice, black had lots of success with it. Here, when you play c4, you just don't want to give them d4, because any d4 we're just going to take, and whether you take by bishop or queen, I'm just going to play knight c5, bishop b7. That comes down with the tempo. They go with a4, bishop b7, and that's the full flexibility we're always going for in these positions. Now they have d4, in which case we take queen d3, knight c5, queen e2, and b takes a4. This position is absolutely, turns out to be absolutely fine in practice for black. The thing is, when they play e5, we just take, threaten, checkmate. They gotta play f3, bishop d6, threaten the knight at some point. Knight e2, queen e5, exchanging everything, and it's equalish. Yes, they do have a bishop here, but currently they're down a pawn. They gotta put lots of efforts to get a pawn back, and we have a nice position. Apart from that, after queen e2, b takes a4, I believe that most of these guys would like to play bishop e3 to take on c5 so they can capture on a4 afterwards because the king is in the center. You need to remember the full flexibility with knight after d7. So any bishop c5 to be able to answer like this, and after rook a4, not to fall for their exchange sack and take on a4, in which case our king would be weak, but just to play bishop e7, play short castle, and play game like this. Here I want to show you one more thing. I found e5 in so many games. e5, which opens up the bishop, which threatens the pawn on d6, but at the same time which opens up the bishop on b7. It's very interesting. They only found one game where black played bishop takes f3. You know what? You can play d5, but then you will forever have like a weak bishop on d5. And I don't think you should play like this. Also, with the rook on the fourth rank, bishop getting open, I believe that I have a very serious attacking chances all of a sudden. That's why, after e5, you just have to go with bishop takes f3, and then d5. Now you got rid of the weak bishop. You're holding the center. You got rid of one more piece that could join the attack. I'm talking about the knight on f3. And here, Hilar Persson played against his opponent who played b4, young GM from Slovenia, Subel, who played b4, and now he's got a weakness with the backward c3 pawn. And I believe it's weak. I believe it's weak. The guy played queen h5, g6. He was supposed to play king g7 and be much better. Everything is just so solid. White doesn't have the dark square bishop. Black would be good. I don't think d5, b4 should be an answer, but I believe that black has relatively cool and nice flexible game here. I want to show one more thing here. So we've just analyzed after a6 bishop to d3, and I explained you that this bishop goes back to c2 after c3 bishop c2 and d4. You go knight g on f6, they go rook e1, you go e6. They go on any a4, you just go with a flexible system with this, and always that c4 move. Always that c4 move. It's so annoying for these guys who would like to go with d4 in these flexible systems. When they go c3, you play b5, they go bishop c2, once again that c4 move. I wanted to show you a line where they decide to take on b5, take on a8, and then play line like this. Here I found a line with a great compensation for black, and from practical point of view, very nice for playing. Knight a3, where they go after the pawn on b5, and the pawn on e4 is just weak. We play bishop e7. Knight b5, threatening check, and doing the fork. We just go short castle, avoiding everything, and they just go any d3, you always take, and you're fine. So they defend the pawn, and looks like they're defending the pawn, attacking the pawn, and they're already up a pawn. And here, GM Gozoli from France played a nice game, played rook c8, overprotecting the pawn, and I always feel that this pawn is very difficult for white players. This bishop is a long-term problem. That's why I believe they gotta play d3. So we they can play knight c5. In practice, this variation turns out to be a line with a full compensation, even though you're down the pawn, and black should be doing fine. Guys, I really put lots of my effort into this video. I just wanted to make it very, very fresh. You know, like to upload all the latest approaches and games, not to give you only like one idea and play that and to try to make it easy for you. No, I just try to make it complete for you, to give you alternatives, to insist on typical plans and ideas in certain positions, and hopefully you're just gonna have like lots of success with these lines. Thanks for joining the channel, thanks for following, and let's see next time. Thanks so much, and bye bye.